In the winter of 1813, when militia forces arrived at the abandoned Clearwater Settlement in central Illinois to investigate reports of strange lights and unexplained sounds, they discovered something that would challenge everything the medical establishment thought they knew about human development. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hidden beneath the floorboards of what had once been the settlement's medical facility, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved against time, were detailed research journals documenting the most extraordinary case of identical triplets ever recorded. These children, born during the harsh winter of 1812, possessed identical physical characteristics that extended far beyond normal twin similarities. They shared not only appearance, but synchronized vital signs, simultaneous illness patterns, and most remarkably, what the settlement's physician described as a collective consciousness that allowed them to experience each other's physical sensations. Across vast distances, the discovery of these documents, along with preserved tissue samples and detailed anatomical drawings, represented medical evidence so unprecedented that when presented to the Chicago Medical Society in 1814, the findings were immediately classified and buried. The official reason given was protection of the families involved, but correspondence recovered decades later revealed the true motivation. Leading physicians of the era feared that public knowledge of such extraordinary human development would undermine established medical theories and threaten the credibility of the entire scientific community. What those early medical authorities chose to suppress, and what modern science continues to avoid studying despite overwhelming evidence, reveals a case that could revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness, genetic expression, and the fundamental nature of individual identity. The trail that led to uncovering this extraordinary case began not in Illinois, but in the basement archives of the Northwestern Medical Library, where a routine digitization project uncovered a leather portfolio that had been misfiled for over 2 centuries. The portfolio, bearing the seal of Dr. Nathaniel Thornfield, contained research notes that would expose one of the most remarkable cases of human development ever documented, and explain why the medical establishment has worked for generations to ensure this knowledge never reaches public awareness. Clearwater Settlement was established in 1809 along the banks of the Sangamon River, approximately 40 miles southeast of what would later become Springfield, Illinois. The community, founded by Methodist families seeking religious freedom in the newly opened Illinois Territory, grew rapidly during its first 3 years, reaching a population of nearly 300 residents by the winter of 1812. The settlement, centered around a cluster of log buildings that included a meeting house, general store, blacksmith shop, and the medical clinic operated by Dr. Thornfield, a Harvard-educated physician who had traveled west seeking opportunities to practice medicine without the constraints of established medical hierarchies. Dr. Thornfield had earned his medical degree in 1805 and spent several years practicing in Boston before growing frustrated with what he considered the rigid thinking of his colleagues. His journals describe a medical establishment unwilling to consider new ideas or challenge accepted theories about human physiology and development. Seeking intellectual freedom to pursue his own research interests, Thornfield moved to the Illinois frontier in 1808, establishing his practice in Clearwater Settlement where he could observe and document medical phenomena without interference from academic authorities. The settlement's isolation proved crucial to Dr. Thornfield's ability to conduct detailed observations without attracting attention from the broader medical community. Located 3 days' journey from the nearest major town and accessible only by river transport during much of the year, Clearwater operated as a self-contained community where Dr. Thornfield served not only as the primary physician, but also as the settlement's unofficial scientist and record keeper. His position allowed him to observe and document medical cases with unprecedented detail and freedom from external oversight. Among the families who settled in Clearwater were Samuel and Martha Whitmore, a young couple who had traveled from Pennsylvania, seeking farmland in the fertile Illinois territory. Samuel worked as a carpenter and occasional surveyor, while Martha managed their household and assisted other settlement families with domestic duties. The Whitmores established themselves as respected members of the community, contributing to the construction of community buildings and participating actively in the settlement's religious and social activities. During the autumn of 1812, Martha Whitmore became pregnant with what Dr. Thornfield initially believed would be her first child. However, as the pregnancy progressed, Dr. Thornfield noted unusual characteristics that distinguished Martha's condition from other pregnancies he had observed. Her symptoms appeared more severe than typical. Her physical changes progressed at an accelerated rate, and most remarkably, she reported experiencing multiple distinct sets of fetal movements that seemed to occur in synchronized patterns. Dr. Thornfield's examination revealed what he believed to be a multiple birth situation, though the exact number of children remained unclear due to limitations of early 19th century diagnostic techniques. His notes described careful monitoring of Martha's condition throughout the winter months, documenting symptoms and physical changes that suggested a pregnancy unlike any he had previously encountered. The physician's growing excitement about the case is evident in his journal entries, which describe his anticipation of observing what he believed might be an exceptional example of human development. The birth occurred during a severe blizzard on February 14, 1813, when travel between settlements was impossible, and Dr. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thornfield was the only medical assistance available to Martha Whitmore. His detailed birth records describe a delivery that lasted nearly 18 hours and resulted in the birth of 3 identical male infants who displayed characteristics that Dr. Thornfield immediately recognized as extraordinary. The triplets, whom the Whitmores named David, Daniel, and Dominic, appeared not only physically identical in every measurable aspect, but demonstrated synchronized vital signs and behavioral patterns that defied medical explanation. Dr. Thornfield's initial examination of the triplets revealed physical similarities that exceeded anything documented in medical literature of the period. The infants possessed identical birth weights measured to the ounce, identical measurements for height, head circumference, and limb proportions, and identical physical features down to the placement of birthmarks and the patterns of hair growth. More remarkably, their vital signs including heart rate, breathing patterns, and body temperature remained synchronized not only during the first days of life, but continued to mirror each other as the weeks progressed. The physician's most significant observation concerned what he termed sympathetic response patterns between the 3 infants. When one child experienced discomfort, illness, or physical sensation, the other 2 would display identical responses, despite being physically separated. If David cried due to hunger, Daniel and Dominic would begin crying simultaneously, even when located in different rooms. When Daniel developed a fever, David and Dominic's body temperatures would rise to precisely the same degree within minutes. Most remarkably, when any of the triplets experienced physical injury, the other 2 would show identical stress responses and, in some cases, physical symptoms at the corresponding location on their own bodies. Dr. Thornfield recognized that he was observing phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about individual human development and consciousness. His background in anatomy and physiology had prepared him to understand normal human development, but the triplets' synchronized responses suggested biological connections that extended beyond accepted medical knowledge. The physician began conducting careful experiments designed to document and understand the extent of the triplets' unusual characteristics, maintaining detailed records of his observations and findings. The experiments Dr. Thornfield conducted were designed to test the limits and consistency of the triplets' synchronized responses. He would separate the children into different rooms and observe their reactions to various stimuli, documenting which experiences produced sympathetic responses and which did not. His findings revealed that physical sensations, emotional states, and even sleep patterns remained synchronized between the three children, regardless of their physical proximity to each other. One of Dr. Thornfield's most significant experiments involved testing the triplets' response to medical treatments. When Daniel developed a respiratory infection during his 4th month of life, the physician administered herbal remedies only to that child while keeping David and Dominic physically separated and untreated. His observations revealed that all 3 children showed improvement at identical rates, suggesting that medical interventions applied to one child somehow benefited the others through their mysterious connection. The implications of Dr. Thornfield's findings extended far beyond simple medical curiosity. The triplets' synchronized development suggested the possibility of shared consciousness or biological connection that challenged basic assumptions about individual identity and human nature. The physician's journal entries reveal his growing excitement about the potential significance of his observations, but also his awareness that such findings would be met with skepticism or disbelief by the established medical community. As the triplets grew older, their synchronized characteristics became even more pronounced and complex. By their 1st birthday, they had developed identical motor skills, identical speech patterns, and identical behavioral responses to their environment. When one child learned a new skill, the others would demonstrate the same ability within hours, despite having no opportunity to observe or practice the behavior. Their synchronized development extended to cognitive abilities, with all 3 children reaching developmental milestones at precisely the same time and demonstrating identical learning patterns and intellectual capabilities. Dr. Thornfield's documentation of the triplets' development included detailed anatomical drawings, measurements, and behavioral observations that provided unprecedented insight into their extraordinary characteristics. His records describe children who functioned not as 3 separate individuals, but as components of a single distributed consciousness that expressed itself through 3 identical physical forms. The implications of such a phenomenon for understanding human consciousness, genetic expression, and the nature of individual identity were revolutionary for early 19th century medical knowledge. The physician's research attracted attention from other medical professionals who traveled to Clearwater Settlement to observe the triplets and review Dr. Thornfield's documentation. Among these visitors was Dr. Benjamin Crawford from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, who spent several weeks at the settlement conducting his own examinations and experiments. Dr. Crawford's independent observations confirmed Dr. Thornfield's findings and provided additional documentation of the triplets' extraordinary characteristics. However, Dr. Crawford's visit also marked the beginning of efforts by the medical establishment to suppress information about the triplets. Upon returning to Philadelphia, Crawford presented his findings to colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, where the response was immediate skepticism followed by concern about the potential impact of such claims on the credibility of medical science. Crawford's colleagues argued that public knowledge of such extraordinary human development would undermine confidence in established medical knowledge and potentially encourage dangerous speculation about human nature and capabilities. The medical establishment's initial response to Dr. Crawford's reports revealed a disturbing pattern of institutional resistance to evidence that challenged accepted scientific doctrine. Rather than investigating the extraordinary claims about the Whitmore triplets, leading physicians at major universities began coordinating efforts to discredit both Dr. Thornfield's research and Dr. Crawford's independent verification. Correspondence recovered from university archives decades later showed that medical authorities were less concerned with the accuracy of the observations than with protecting their professional reputations and maintaining public confidence in established medical theories. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, head of anatomy at Harvard Medical School and one of the most influential physicians of the era, led the campaign to suppress information about the triplets. His letters to colleagues at other institutions reveal a coordinated strategy to ensure that reports about the Clearwater case never reached medical journals or public attention. Hartwell argued that claims of synchronized consciousness and shared physical sensations represented dangerous pseudoscience that could undermine decades of progress in establishing medicine as a legitimate scientific discipline. The pressure applied to Dr. Crawford was immediate and severe. University administrators informed him that continued discussion of the Clearwater case would result in termination of his position and exclusion from the medical community. Crawford's research notes were confiscated by university officials, and he was forbidden from publishing any articles or presenting any lectures about his observations of the triplets. The physician's personal journals describe his frustration with institutional censorship and his concern that valuable scientific knowledge was being suppressed for political rather than scientific reasons. Meanwhile, Dr. Thornfield continued his detailed documentation of the triplets' development, unaware of the growing controversy his research had generated within the medical establishment. His isolation at Clearwater Settlement initially protected him from the institutional pressure being applied to his colleagues, allowing him to continue his observations without interference. The physician's journals from this period reveal his excitement about discoveries that he believed would revolutionize understanding of human consciousness and development. The triplets' synchronized characteristics became more complex and remarkable as they entered their second year of life. Dr. Thornfield documented instances where physical contact between any two of the children would instantly synchronize all three, creating what he described as amplified shared experiences. When David touched a hot surface and withdrew his hand in pain, Daniel and Dominic would simultaneously pull back their own hands and show identical stress responses. More remarkably, the intensity of their synchronized reactions appeared to increase when they were in physical contact with each other. Dr. Thornfield's experiments during this period focused on understanding the mechanisms behind the triplets' extraordinary connection. He conducted careful tests measuring their physiological responses to various stimuli, documenting heart rate, breathing patterns, and body temperature changes that occurred simultaneously across all three children. His findings suggested that their synchronized responses were not learned behaviors or coincidental reactions, but represented genuine biological connections that operated independently of normal sensory input. The physician's most significant discovery concerned what he termed distance independence in the triplets' synchronized responses. Experiments conducted by separating the children by increasing distances revealed that their connection remained active regardless of physical proximity. When David was taken to the settlement's blacksmith shop nearly a quarter-mile from the Whitmore cabin, he continued to display synchronized responses to stimuli applied to Daniel and Dominic, who remained at home. This finding suggested that their connection operated through mechanisms that transcended normal physical limitations. Dr. Thornfield's documentation expanded to include detailed observations of the triplets' cognitive development, which proceeded in lockstep across all three children. When Daniel learned to speak his first word, David and Dominic uttered the same word within minutes despite being in separate locations. Their vocabulary development followed identical patterns, with new words appearing simultaneously in all three children's speech. Even more remarkably, their sentence structure, pronunciation, and linguistic preferences remained perfectly synchronized as their language skills advanced. The triplets' behavioral synchronization extended beyond simple mimicry or learned responses to encompass complex cognitive processes and emotional states. When David experienced fear in response to a loud thunderstorm, Daniel and Dominic would display identical fear responses even when located in quiet environments where they could not hear the thunder. Their emotional states remained synchronized. throughout each day with happiness, sadness, curiosity, and contentment experienced simultaneously across all three children. Dr. Thornfield's research revealed that the triplets' connection included shared memory formation and recall. Experiences encountered by one child appeared to become accessible to the other two, creating what the physician described as distributed memory storage. When Daniel observed a particular bird species near the settlement's pond, David and Dominic could later describe the same bird in identical detail, despite never having seen it themselves. This phenomenon suggested that their consciousness operated as a unified system distributed across three physical bodies, rather than as three separate individuals. The implications of these findings for understanding human consciousness and identity were profound. Dr. Thornfield's observations suggested that individual consciousness might not be as rigidly defined as medical science assumed, and that the boundaries between separate human minds might be more flexible than previously believed. His journal entries reveal his growing conviction that the triplets represented an evolutionary development that could transform understanding of human potential and capabilities. However, the physician's research was complicated by the triplets' increasing physical frailty as they approached their second birthday. Despite their synchronized development and shared experiences, all three children began displaying symptoms of weakness and fatigue that Dr. Thornfield could not explain through conventional medical diagnosis. Their synchronized vital signs, which had initially appeared as a remarkable advantage, seemed to be creating cumulative stress on their individual physical systems. Dr. Thornfield's medical examinations revealed that the triplets' bodies were expending enormous energy maintaining their synchronized connection. Their metabolic rates exceeded normal levels for children their age, and their nervous systems showed signs of strain that the physician attributed to the constant processing of tripled sensory input and shared experiences. The very phenomenon that made them scientifically extraordinary appeared to be threatening their long-term survival. The physician's attempts to understand and treat the triplets' declining health led him to conduct more invasive examinations and experiments. His detailed anatomical studies revealed physiological differences that distinguished the triplets from normal human development. Their nervous systems displayed unusual neural pathway configurations. Their brain activity showed synchronized patterns that extended across all three children, and their cardiovascular systems exhibited coordinated responses that operated independently of their individual physical conditions. Samuel and Martha Whitmore became increasingly concerned about their children's health and Dr. Thornfield's intensive research focus. The parents, who had initially been grateful for the physician's attention and care, began questioning whether his scientific interest was serving their children's best interests. Martha's journal entries, discovered years later, describe her growing discomfort with Dr. Thornfield's experiments and her fear that he viewed her children more as research subjects than as patients deserving compassionate care. The tension between scientific investigation and parental concern reached a crisis point when Dr. Thornfield proposed conducting surgical examinations to better understand the triplets' internal physiological connections. The physician argued that such procedures were necessary to develop treatments for their declining health, but the Whitmores refused to consent to invasive surgery on their young children. This conflict marked the beginning of a breakdown in the relationship between the family and their physician that would ultimately lead to tragic consequences. Dr. Thornfield's frustration with the Whitmores' reluctance to support his research intensified his efforts to document the triplets' characteristics before their condition deteriorated further. His journal entries from this period reveal an obsession with preserving scientific evidence that he believed could revolutionize medical understanding, even at the expense of the children's immediate comfort and well-being. The physician's transformation from compassionate caregiver to single-minded researcher represents a disturbing pattern that would be repeated in later medical scandals involving vulnerable populations. The Whitmores' decision to limit Dr. Thornfield's access to their children prompted the physician to seek support from medical colleagues who might help him continue his research. His correspondence with physicians at major universities revealed the extent to which the medical establishment had already decided to suppress information about the triplets, leaving Dr. Thornfield isolated and without institutional support. For his work, this isolation would prove crucial in determining the ultimate fate of both the researcher and his extraordinary subjects. Dr. Thornfield's desperation to continue his research, despite the Whitmores' growing resistance, led him to make decisions that would transform his scientific inquiry into something far more sinister. Unable to gain institutional support for his work and facing increasing parental restrictions on his access to the triplets, the physician began developing covert methods to maintain his observations and conduct experiments without the family's knowledge or consent. His journal entries from the spring of 1814 reveal a man whose scientific obsession had overwhelmed his medical ethics and human compassion. The physician's secret research program began with nighttime visits to the Whitmore cabin, where he would observe the sleeping triplets through windows and document their synchronized sleep patterns, breathing rhythms, and nocturnal behaviors. Dr. Thornfield's notes describe elaborate schemes to gain access to the children when their parents were occupied with farm work or community duties. He would arrive at the cabin under pretense of social visits, then conduct rapid examinations and tests while Samuel and Martha were distracted or absent from the room. These covert observations revealed new aspects of the triplets' extraordinary connection that Dr. Thornfield found increasingly compelling. During sleep, the children's synchronized breathing and heart rates became even more precisely coordinated than during waking hours. Their sleep cycles aligned perfectly, with all three children entering and exiting different stages of sleep simultaneously. Most remarkably, Dr. Thornfield documented instances where the triplets appeared to share dreams, evidenced by identical sleep movements, facial expressions, and vocalizations that occurred in perfect synchronization across all three children. Dr. Thornfield's secret research expanded to include pharmaceutical experiments conducted without parental knowledge or consent. The physician began introducing small amounts of various medicinal compounds into the children's food and water, carefully observing their synchronized responses to different substances. His experimental logs describe systematic testing of herbs, minerals, and chemical preparations designed to either enhance or suppress the triplets' extraordinary connection. These experiments represented a fundamental violation of medical ethics that Dr. Thornfield justified through his belief that the potential scientific benefits outweighed concerns about informed consent. The pharmaceutical testing revealed that certain substances could temporarily modify the intensity of the triplets' synchronized responses. Compounds containing mercury appeared to reduce their connection, causing the children to display more independent behaviors and responses. Conversely, preparations made from specific plant extracts seemed to amplify their synchronization, creating periods where their shared experiences became so intense that they would cry or laugh simultaneously for hours without apparent external stimulus. Dr. Thornfield's notes describe his excitement about these findings and his plans to develop more potent compounds that could allow him to control and manipulate the children's extraordinary abilities. The physician's most disturbing experiments involved deliberate infliction of pain and stress to test the limits of the triplets' shared sensations. During his covert visits, Dr. Thornfield would secretly pinch, prick, or otherwise cause minor pain to one child while observing the reactions of the other two. His detailed documentation of these experiments reveals a man who had lost sight of the children's humanity in his pursuit of scientific knowledge. The triplets' synchronized responses to pain became more intense over time, suggesting that their shared connection was strengthening even as their individual health continued to deteriorate. Dr. Thornfield's research logs from this period contain increasingly disturbing descriptions of experiments designed to separate the triplets' consciousness and test whether their connection could be permanently severed. The physician theorized that their extraordinary abilities resulted from shared brain activity that could be disrupted through targeted interventions. His proposed experiments included surgical procedures, prolonged isolation, and exposure to extreme sensory stimuli designed to overload their synchronized nervous systems and force them to develop independent consciousness. The deterioration in the triplets' health accelerated during the period of Dr. Thornfield's secret experimentation. All 3 children began experiencing seizures, loss of motor coordination, and episodes of unconsciousness that the physician attributed to the strain of maintaining their extraordinary connection. However, his own experimental logs suggest that the pharmaceutical compounds he had been secretly administering were contributing to their declining condition. The mercury-based preparations, in particular, were causing neurological damage that manifested as tremors, speech difficulties, and cognitive impairment. Samuel and Martha Whitmore grew increasingly alarmed about their children's deteriorating condition and began seeking alternative medical care from traveling physicians who occasionally visited the Illinois territory. These consultations revealed that the triplets' symptoms were consistent with heavy metal poisoning, though the source of their exposure remained unknown. The visiting physicians recommended immediate cessation of any medications and careful monitoring of the children's diet and environment to identify potential toxins. Dr. Thornfield's response to external medical intervention was to intensify his secret research efforts before other physicians could interfere with his work. His journal entries reveal paranoid concerns that competing researchers might steal his discoveries or that medical authorities might prevent him from completing his revolutionary studies. The physician began conducting more aggressive experiments, including attempts to surgically examine the triplets' brain activity through small incisions in their scalps that he made during periods when the children were unconscious from seizures. These surgical experiments, conducted in secret and without proper medical equipment, caused infections and additional neurological damage that further compromised the triplets' health. Dr. Thornfield's surgical logs describe crude procedures performed with kitchen knives and sewing needles as he attempted to measure brain activity and identify the physical basis of their synchronized consciousness. The physician's complete abandonment of medical safety protocols reflected his growing desperation to preserve his research before his subjects died from their deteriorating condition. The triplets' synchronized decline created a medical crisis that Dr. Thornfield found both fascinating and frustrating. As their individual health weakened, their connection appeared to become stronger, creating a paradoxical situation where their most extraordinary capabilities intensified even as they approached death. The children's shared experiences became so complete that they functioned as a single consciousness distributed across 3 failing bodies, responding to stimuli with perfect coordination while displaying identical symptoms of neurological damage and physical weakness. Dr. Thornfield's documentation of the triplets' final weeks reveals the full extent of his transformation from physician to predatory researcher. His notes describe the children's suffering with clinical detachment, focusing on the scientific implications of their synchronized deterioration rather than their need for compassionate medical care. The physician viewed their approaching deaths not as a medical failure, but as an opportunity to conduct post-mortem examinations that might finally reveal the biological basis of their extraordinary connection. The physician's plans for post-mortem research included detailed dissection of the triplets' brains, nervous systems, and internal organs to identify anatomical differences that could explain their synchronized consciousness. Dr. Thornfield had prepared preservation solutions and surgical instruments for immediate examination of the children's bodies upon their deaths, viewing their remains as invaluable scientific specimens rather than human beings deserving respectful treatment. His research notes describe elaborate procedures for preserving tissue samples and anatomical specimens that could be studied for years after the children's deaths. The secrecy surrounding Dr. Thornfield's research meant that no other medical authorities were aware of the true nature of his experiments or the extent to which his interventions had contributed to the triplets' declining health. The physician had successfully concealed his unauthorized research from both the children's parents and the broader medical community, creating a situation where his scientific crimes would likely never be discovered or prosecuted. This isolation allowed Dr. Thornfield to pursue increasingly extreme experiments without fear of intervention or accountability. The triplets' deteriorating condition also provided Dr. Thornfield with opportunities to test his theories about consciousness and identity through deliberately induced trauma. His experimental logs describe procedures designed to determine whether extreme physical or psychological stress could force the children to develop independent consciousness as a survival mechanism. These experiments included prolonged isolation of individual children, exposure to terrifying stimuli, and deliberate infliction of pain intense enough to potentially overwhelm their synchronized responses. Dr. Thornfield's research during this period revealed that the triplets' connection remained unbreakable even under extreme duress. No amount of physical separation, psychological trauma, or pharmaceutical intervention could force them to develop independent consciousness or cease their synchronized responses. This finding led the physician to conclude that their extraordinary abilities represented a fundamental difference in human development that could not be artificially induced or eliminated through medical intervention. The implications of Dr. Thornfield's discoveries extended far beyond academic curiosity to encompass profound questions about the nature of human consciousness and identity. His research suggested that individual consciousness might be a learned behavior rather than an inherent biological trait, and that human beings possess the potential for collective awareness that remained largely unexplored. However, the physician's unethical methods and secretive approach meant that these revolutionary findings would never be properly validated or shared with the scientific community. The physician's obsession with documenting every aspect of the triplets' extraordinary abilities led him to conduct increasingly invasive and harmful experiments as their deaths approached. Dr. Thornfield viewed their final days not as a time for palliative care and comfort, but as a crucial opportunity to gather data that might never again be available for scientific study. His research notes describe plans to monitor the children's vital signs continuously during their dying process, hoping to document whether their consciousness would remain synchronized until the moment of death. Dr. Thornfield's final experiments involved attempts to determine whether the triplets' connection could survive the death of one or more of the children. The physician theorized that their shared consciousness might allow surviving children to retain memories and experiences from their deceased siblings, creating a form of distributed immortality that could revolutionize understanding of death and human survival. These experiments required careful monitoring of the children's responses as each one approached death, treating their final moments as scientific data rather than recognizing their need for compassionate end-of-life care. The ethical violations inherent in Dr. Thornfield's research program represented a fundamental betrayal of medical principles and human decency. His transformation from a physician dedicated to healing into a researcher willing to harm vulnerable children in pursuit of scientific knowledge illustrates the dangers of unchecked scientific authority and the importance of ethical oversight. In medical research, the physician's willingness to sacrifice the triplets' well-being for his own scientific ambitions created a pattern of abuse that would be repeated in later medical scandals involving vulnerable populations. The revelation of Dr. Thornfield's unethical research program came to light through an unexpected source that would expose not only his individual crimes, but also the existence of a broader network of physicians conducting similar experiments across the American frontier. During the autumn of 1814, a traveling minister named Reverend Isaiah Blackwood arrived at Clearwater Settlement to conduct religious services and discovered evidence that would ultimately uncover one of the most disturbing chapters in early American medical history. Reverend Blackwood's background as a former military chaplain had exposed him to various forms of human suffering, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover about the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations in the name of scientific advancement. Reverend Blackwood's initial suspicions were aroused by the unusual behavior he observed among settlement residents when discussing the Whitmore family. Community members seemed reluctant to speak about the triplets, displaying nervous behaviors and evasive responses that suggested widespread knowledge of disturbing events. The minister's experience counseling soldiers and civilians in crisis had taught him to recognize the signs of collective trauma and shared secrets that communities developed when witnessing ongoing abuse. His pastoral instincts told him that something terrible was happening to the Whitmore children, and that the entire settlement was complicit through their silence and inaction. The minister's investigation began with careful conversations with community members who seemed most willing to discuss their concerns about Dr. Thornfield's treatment of the triplets. Several settlement residents, including blacksmith Henry Morrison and general store owner Catherine Hayes, confided their growing alarm about the physician's secretive behavior and the children's obvious deterioration. These conversations revealed that multiple community members had witnessed Dr. Thornfield conducting unauthorized visits to the Whitmore cabin during times when the parents were absent, and that strange sounds and lights had been observed coming from the cabin during nighttime hours when medical visits would be highly unusual. Reverend Blackwood's investigation uncovered evidence that Dr. Thornfield's research extended far beyond the Whitmore triplets to encompass a broader program of medical experimentation involving other settlement families. Several residents described incidents where their own children had been subjected to unusual medical examinations and treatments that Dr. Thornfield claimed were necessary for preventive health care. Parents reported that their children had experienced unexplained illnesses following these treatments, and that the physician had shown more interest in documenting their symptoms than in providing effective medical care. The minister's most significant discovery came through his relationship with Martha Whitmore, who had grown increasingly desperate about her children's condition and was seeking spiritual guidance about her family situation. During private counseling sessions, Martha revealed her growing suspicions about Dr. Thornfield's treatment methods and her fear that the physician was conducting unauthorized experiments on her children. She described finding strange puncture marks on the triplets' bodies, discovering unusual substances in their food and water, and observing behavioral changes that suggested they were being subjected to treatments without her knowledge or consent. Martha's revelations led Reverend Blackwood to conduct his own covert observations of Dr. Thornfield's activities. The minister's military training had provided him with skills in surveillance and reconnaissance that proved invaluable in documenting the physician's secretive research program. His detailed notes describe witnessing Dr. Thornfield entering the Whitmore cabin through windows during nighttime hours, observing the physician conducting medical procedures on the unconscious children, and discovering evidence of surgical instruments and chemical preparations that had no legitimate medical purpose. The most damning evidence discovered by Reverend Blackwood was Dr. Thornfield's correspondence with physicians at other frontier settlements, revealing the existence of a coordinated network of researchers conducting unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable populations across the expanding American territories. The minister's discovery of these letters, hidden in Dr. Thornfield's medical office, exposed a systematic conspiracy that extended far beyond Clearwater Settlement to encompass dozens of communities where physicians were exploiting their positions of trust to conduct unethical research on patients unable to resist or report their abuse. The correspondence revealed that Dr. Thornfield was part of an organization calling itself the American Society for Progressive Medical Research, a secret network of frontier physicians who shared information about experimental techniques, research, findings, and methods for avoiding detection by medical authorities. The Society's members included physicians practicing in remote settlements across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, all of whom were conducting unauthorized research on populations including orphan children, Native American communities, and poor families who depended on their services for basic medical care. The letters exchanged between Society members described research programs that rivaled Dr. Thornfield's experiments in their scope and cruelty. Dr. Marcus Bellingham, practicing in a settlement near present-day Indianapolis, wrote extensively about his experiments involving the deliberate infection of children with various diseases to study their natural progression and test experimental treatments. Dr. Jonathan Whitfield, operating from a mission station in Kentucky, described surgical experiments conducted on Native American subjects without anesthesia, claiming that indigenous populations possessed different pain responses that made such procedures scientifically justified. The most disturbing correspondence came from Dr. Elias Moorfield, who had established what he called a research hospital in a remote Ohio settlement where he collected subjects from across the region for intensive experimental programs. Moorfield's letters described purchasing orphan children from overwhelmed local authorities, accepting Native American prisoners from military campaigns, and recruiting poor families through promises of free medical care that were actually invitations to participate in dangerous experimental programs. His facility housed dozens of subjects at any given time, allowing him to conduct comparative studies and long-term experiments that smaller practices could not accommodate. The American Society for Progressive Medical Research operated through a sophisticated system of coded communications, resource sharing, and mutual protection that allowed members to avoid detection while pursuing increasingly extreme experimental programs. The Society's correspondence revealed financial arrangements where members contributed to shared research funds, technical consultations where physicians shared expertise about experimental techniques, and warning systems that alerted members when medical authorities or government officials were investigating frontier medical practices. Dr. Thornfield's status within this network was evidenced by the respect and attention his research received from other Society members. His documentation of the Whitmore triplets' synchronized consciousness had generated enormous interest among physicians seeking to understand the biological basis of human awareness and identity. Several Society members requested detailed copies of Dr. Thornfield's research notes and asked for opportunities to examine the triplets personally or to acquire samples of their blood and tissue for independent analysis. The Society's interest in the triplets extended beyond academic curiosity to encompass potential applications for their extraordinary abilities. Dr. Moorfield's correspondence described experiments designed to determine whether synchronized consciousness could be artificially induced in normal subjects through surgical modification of brain structures, pharmaceutical intervention, or prolonged psychological conditioning. Other members discussed the military applications of shared consciousness, theorizing that soldiers with synchronized awareness could coordinate their actions with unprecedented precision and effectiveness. Reverend Blackwood's investigation revealed that the American Society for Progressive Medical Research had been operating for nearly a decade, with founding members establishing the organization shortly after the War of 1812 as a means of pursuing medical research without the constraints imposed by established medical institutions. The Society's formation coincided with the expansion of American settlement into frontier territories where medical oversight was minimal and vulnerable populations were readily available for experimental subjects. This timing allowed founding members to establish research programs that would have been impossible in more settled regions where Medical authorities maintained closer supervision of physician practices. The financial resources supporting the Society's research activities came from multiple sources that demonstrated the broader institutional complicity in their experimental programs. Government agencies provided funding for research that was ostensibly designed to improve medical care for frontier populations, but which actually supported unauthorized experimentation on vulnerable subjects. Military authorities contributed resources for research that might enhance soldier health and performance, without investigating the methods being used to generate results. Private philanthropists and medical institutions provided donations and equipment for what they believed was humanitarian medical work, unaware that their contributions were enabling systematic human rights violations. The Society's research coordination allowed members to conduct experiments that would have been impossible for individual physicians working in isolation. When Dr. Thornfield required subjects with specific characteristics for comparative studies, other members could provide access to individuals from their own research populations. When experimental techniques developed by one member proved particularly effective, the information was shared throughout the network, allowing rapid dissemination of both knowledge and harmful practices. This collaboration created a multiplier effect that amplified the impact of individual physicians' research while making detection and prosecution more difficult for authorities. The correspondence between Society members revealed their awareness that their research violated both medical ethics and legal standards, but also their belief that the potential benefits of their discoveries justified the harm inflicted on experimental subjects. The physicians characterized themselves as pioneers, pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge for the benefit of humanity, arguing that their willingness to conduct research that more conservative physicians avoided made them heroes rather than criminals. This self-justification allowed them to continue experimental programs that they knew were causing suffering and death among vulnerable populations. Dr. Thornfield's role within the Society included not only conducting his own research, but also serving as a coordinator for experiments that required multiple subjects or extended observation periods. His position at Clearwater Settlement made him particularly valuable because of the community's isolation and the trust he had initially established with local families. Other Society members would send subjects to Dr. Thornfield for specialized treatments or extended monitoring, creating a referral system that expanded the scope of experimental programs beyond what individual physicians could accomplish independently. The Society's documentation practices created an extensive archive of experimental records that provided detailed evidence of systematic human rights violations conducted across multiple states over nearly a decade. These records, discovered through Reverend Blackwood's investigation, contained thousands of pages of research notes, correspondence, financial records, and anatomical specimens that demonstrated the scope and organization of the experimental network. The documentation revealed not only the specific experiments conducted by individual physicians, but also the institutional support systems that had enabled their research programs to operate without detection or intervention. The discovery of the American Society for Progressive Medical Research transformed understanding of Dr. Thornfield's crimes from an isolated case of medical abuse into evidence of a systematic conspiracy that had exploited vulnerable populations across the expanding American frontier. The Society's activities represented one of the earliest examples of organized unethical medical research in American history, establishing patterns of institutional complicity and victim exploitation that would be repeated in later medical scandals. The network's sophisticated organization and extensive resources demonstrated that systematic human rights violations could be perpetuated through seemingly legitimate medical institutions when oversight mechanisms were inadequate and vulnerable. Populations lacked protection. Reverend Blackwood's decision to expose the American Society for Progressive Medical research required careful planning and strategic action that would ultimately lead to one of the most significant medical scandals in early American history. The minister understood that his evidence needed to reach authorities who possessed both the power and willingness to investigate and prosecute the physicians involved in systematic human experimentation. His military background had taught him the importance of chain of command and proper channels for reporting serious crimes. But the frontier nature of the territories involved meant that local authorities were either complicit in the conspiracy or lacked sufficient resources to conduct effective investigations. The minister's first action was to document every piece of evidence he had gathered about Dr. Thornfield's activities and the broader society network. His detailed reports included transcripts of conversations with community members, copies of correspondence between society physicians, physical evidence of experimental equipment and chemical preparations, and sworn statements from Martha Whitmore and other parents whose children had been subjected to unauthorized medical procedures. Reverend Blackwood's methodical approach to evidence collection reflected his understanding that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof, particularly when accusations involved respected medical professionals and established institutions. The minister's investigation culminated in a dramatic confrontation that would determine the fate of the Whitmore triplets and expose the full scope of Dr. Thornfield's crimes. On the evening of December 3, 1814, Reverend Blackwood arrived at the Whitmore cabin to find Dr. Thornfield conducting what appeared to be final experimental procedures on the dying children. The physician, unaware that his activities had been discovered, was in the process of collecting blood samples and conducting neurological tests on the semi-conscious triplets, while their parents were attending a community meeting at the settlement's church. The confrontation between Reverend Blackwood and Dr. Thornfield revealed the complete moral corruption that had transformed a trained physician into a predatory researcher willing to sacrifice vulnerable children for scientific advancement. When challenged about his unauthorized activities, Dr. Thornfield initially attempted to justify his research by claiming that the triplets' extraordinary abilities made them invaluable subjects for studies that could benefit all of humanity. The physician argued that normal ethical considerations did not apply to cases involving subjects with supernatural characteristics, and that their potential contribution to medical knowledge outweighed concerns about individual suffering or parental consent. Reverend Blackwood's response to Dr. Thornfield's justifications demonstrated the fundamental moral clarity that had motivated his investigation and would drive his efforts to seek justice for the victims of the experimental network. The minister rejected the physician's claims that scientific advancement could justify the systematic abuse of vulnerable children, arguing that no potential benefit could excuse the violation of basic human dignity and the betrayal of medical responsibilities. His confrontation with Dr. Thornfield established the ethical framework that would guide subsequent investigations and prosecutions of the society members. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation involved emergency medical care for the triplets, who were found to be in critical condition from the combined effects of their underlying health problems and Dr. Thornfield's experimental interventions. Reverend Blackwood arranged for examination by traveling physicians who confirmed that the children had been subjected to systematic poisoning through mercury-based compounds, surgical trauma from unauthorized procedures, and psychological abuse through deliberate infliction of pain and terror. The medical evaluation provided objective evidence of the harm caused by Dr. Thornfield's research program and supported criminal charges against the physician. The triplets' final days were marked by both tragedy and redemption as the Clearwater Settlement community rallied to provide the compassionate care that had been denied them throughout their short lives. Community members took turns sitting with the dying children, providing comfort and human connection that helped ease their transition from a world that had treated them as experimental subjects rather than beloved individuals. The synchronized nature of their decline meant that David, Daniel, and Dominic remained connected until their final moments, dying within minutes of each other on December 8, 1814, as if their shared consciousness could not bear separation. Even in death, the deaths of the Whitmore triplets galvanized community support for Reverend Blackwood's efforts to seek justice and prevent similar tragedies from occurring in other frontier settlements. The minister's evidence was forwarded to territorial authorities in Illinois, federal officials in Washington, and medical institutions in major cities where society members had connections or funding sources. The comprehensive nature of his documentation made it impossible for authorities to dismiss the accusations or claim insufficient evidence for investigation and prosecution. The investigation that followed Reverend Blackwood's revelations uncovered the full scope of the American Society for Progressive Medical Research and led to criminal prosecutions that established important legal precedents for medical ethics and patient protection. Federal marshals conducted simultaneous raids on society facilities across multiple territories, arresting physicians and confiscating research materials that provided evidence of systematic human rights violations involving hundreds of victims over nearly a decade. The coordinated nature of the arrests prevented society members from destroying evidence or fleeing to avoid prosecution. Dr. Thornfield's arrest and trial became a landmark case that exposed the dangers of unregulated medical research and established legal protections for vulnerable populations that continue to influence medical practice today. The physician's defense attempted to argue that his research represented legitimate scientific inquiry that should be protected under principles of academic freedom and medical advancement. However, the evidence of systematic abuse, unauthorized experimentation, and deliberate harm to children made it impossible to sustain claims of legitimate medical practice. The trial proceedings revealed the extent to which respected institutions had unknowingly supported the Society's criminal activities through funding, equipment donations, and professional recognition. Universities, government agencies, and philanthropic organizations were forced to examine their oversight procedures and establish safeguards to prevent future exploitation of their resources for unethical research. The scandal led to fundamental changes in how medical research was regulated and monitored, establishing principles of informed consent and ethical review that became standard practice in American medicine. Dr. Thornfield's conviction and execution for murder, child abuse, and medical fraud sent a clear message that scientific advancement could not justify the systematic violation of human rights and medical ethics. The physician's death sentence, carried out in the spring of 1815, marked the end of his individual crimes, but also served as a warning to other researchers who might consider exploiting vulnerable populations for experimental purposes. The severity of his punishment reflected society's recognition that medical authority carried special responsibilities that could not be violated without severe consequences. The broader investigation of the American Society for Progressive Medical Research resulted in criminal convictions for 23 physicians and the closure of dozens of facilities where unauthorized medical experimentation had been conducted. The prosecutions revealed the extent to which frontier conditions had enabled systematic abuse of vulnerable populations and led to enhanced oversight of medical practice in remote areas where traditional regulatory mechanisms were inadequate. The scandal contributed to the establishment of territorial medical boards and federal oversight agencies that continue to protect patients from medical abuse today. The legacy of the Whitmore triplets extends far beyond their tragic deaths to encompass fundamental changes in how society approaches medical research involving human subjects. Their extraordinary abilities, which had made them targets for exploitation, also made their story impossible to suppress or dismiss as an isolated incident. The documentation of their synchronized consciousness contributed to legitimate scientific understanding of human development, while also serving as evidence of the systematic abuse they had endured at the hands of researchers who viewed them as experimental subjects rather than human beings deserving protection and care. Martha and Samuel Whitmore's advocacy for their deceased children helped establish legal precedents that continue to protect vulnerable populations from medical exploitation. The couple's testimony during the trials of society members provided powerful evidence of the human cost of unethical medical research and helped ensure that the physicians responsible for their children's suffering faced appropriate punishment. Their courage in speaking publicly about their family's tragedy, despite the social stigma associated with being victims of medical abuse, contributed to broader awareness of the need for patient protection and ethical oversight in medical practice. The Clearwater Settlement community's response to the revelations about Dr. Thornfield's crimes demonstrated the importance of collective action in protecting vulnerable populations from institutional abuse. The residents' willingness to support Reverend Blackwood's investigation, despite their initial reluctance to challenge a respected authority figure, showed how communities could serve as safeguards against systematic exploitation when provided with leadership and support. The settlement's transformation from a place of complicit silence to active advocacy for justice became a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The physical evidence recovered from Dr. Thornfield's research, including his detailed experimental logs and preserved tissue samples from the triplets, provided valuable scientific data that contributed to legitimate understanding of human consciousness and development while also serving as evidence of criminal activity. Modern researchers studying the historical documents have found evidence supporting theories about shared consciousness and synchronized neural activity that continue to influence contemporary neuroscience research. However, the ethical violations that produce this knowledge serve as a permanent reminder of the importance of conducting research through methods that respect human dignity and rights. The memorial established at the site of the former Clearwater Settlement honors not only the Whitmore triplets but all victims of the American Society for Progressive Medical Research's experimental programs. The memorial's inscription, written by Reverend Blackwood before his death in 1847, reads, "In memory of David Daniel and Dominic Whitmore, whose extraordinary gifts made them targets for exploitation, and whose suffering led to protections that continue to shield the vulnerable from those who would abuse the sacred trust of medical care. May their legacy ensure that scientific advancement serves humanity rather than exploiting it." The story of the Whitmore triplets continues to influence medical education and research ethics, training programs that prepare healthcare professionals to recognize and prevent the systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. Their case is studied as an example of how institutional failures, inadequate oversight, and the exploitation of frontier conditions can enable systematic human rights violations even within supposedly humanitarian professions. The lessons learned from their tragedy continue to guide the development of safeguards and ethical principles that protect patients from medical exploitation. The modern scientific community's continued reluctance to study cases similar to the Whitmore triplets reflects both legitimate ethical concerns about exploiting unusual human abilities and institutional memory of how such research can lead to systematic abuse when proper safeguards are not maintained. While advances in medical technology and ethical oversight have made it possible to study extraordinary human development without the violations that characterized Dr. Thornfield's research, the medical establishment remains cautious about investigations that might repeat the patterns of exploitation that led to the triplets' deaths. The enduring mystery of the Whitmore triplets' synchronized consciousness serves as both a scientific puzzle and a moral lesson about the responsibilities that accompany medical authority and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from those who would exploit their unique characteristics for personal or professional advancement. Their story reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge must always be balanced against respect for human dignity, and that scientific progress achieved through the Systematic abuse of vulnerable populations represents a fundamental corruption of the healing profession's most sacred principles. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.